All right, everybody, welcome back to the Design Build Hunt podcast, which is presented by Whitetail Partners. Today, we're talking whitetail habitat design in hill country. All right, Sam, another day, another episode of Design, Build, Hunt. And today we are featuring a hill country piece. We're kind of in the middle of a little mini series here where we're talking about the unique features of different terrain types that folks are dealing with. So last time we talked about farm country, the challenges that come along with farm country, the advantages of a farm country piece and how we might address those. Today we're going to be discussing a hill country piece here. And man, on this one, we're kind of breaking the rules. And I think it's important to note that there are some properties that we just aren't going to be able to do some of the things that we might want to do on a typical piece, right? We are going to have a different approach. Our access is going to look different. We may think differently about, our core of our property or where our deer are bedding or the primary cover or the movement patterns that we're hunting. We're going to think differently about how we're bringing in what our neighbors are doing. And this is a good example of that. So why don't you break down this piece for me? Tell me where we're at, what's the parcel size, and give me a scope of the kind of terrain that we're dealing with.
Great, Josh. Thanks. Wonderful things to tee up there. And what we have here is we're in Southwest Wisconsin. We call it hill country here, and driftless area. Many of know it to be as well. And what we have is these long ridges of land that are often timbered. We get a lot more timbered areas in this country because they're not acres that can be converted into tillable ground. A lot of times down in the valleys, you'll have lowland, you'll have more of a wetland habitat. You might have some farm fields, and that's a lot of times where the roads are and all those things. Access is often low. Sometimes the access is high. So in this up here, these top fields, so we'll call it bottom access, top access, having access from the top is often a desirable thing, but this property doesn't have that. So we'll talk about that as a challenge. But as far as timber goes, it's interconnected. Oftentimes these long ridges run across many properties, and you need to look at the resources you have. You mentioned this before. This property was limited on bedding habitat, on cover. And I think there's a lot of things we're doing to make it a very comfortable place for deer to be and move through, but not necessarily be there all the time. It's a 40-acre property, and that's going to be common too, in that, you may not be holding those deer 24 hours a day on a 40-acre property. And you just need to recognize that, understand what your strengths are and what the property can be improved to be, and also utilize some of those things your neighbors might have. We're going to talk about something really interesting here on this east property line in how deer are able to, or how we are able to hunt it really with very minimal cover, and most of that being on the neighbor's property.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think it's important to note, not every property can do everything equally well, right? Like there are some limitations. Whether it's lowland properties, hill country properties, farm countries, every property is going to have some limitation to it. And our job is to make that property be the best that it can possibly be. Because if we try to force in things that this property can't do well, then we're going to hurt ourselves. We're going to shoot ourselves in the foot moving forward. We're going to really struggle long term on this piece. So talk to me about the first, what I think is the key weakness to deal with, and that is your access. So what's the access here, and how does it differ from how we might approach another piece?
Right. So a lot of times you're going to hear us talk outside in, right? We want to see how many different ways we can get at the perimeter of our property so that we're not being intrusive to the core of the property. Well, we flip that on its head here because we look at it and say it is very difficult to get around to the edge of this property, not to mention looking at what we have. To the east, there are, countless acres of really high quality bedding habitat, daytime area that bucks are going to be, and deer in general. And we have the opportunity to, on this eastern edge here, to to be hunting them and taking advantage of them stepping on our side of the fence, so to speak. And we don't want to come at that from the other side or from around the property line. Some people might say on a simple design, you bulldoze a trail around the property fence and that's your access. You go in on everything. That is not the case here. And also specifically the difficulty of getting up this hill, it's a 250 foot climb to the top, which for some that can be a challenge. Utilizing an existing roadway that comes up to these top fields, that's what that owner really wanted and how they wanted to get up there. And in many ways that made sense. We do have some perimeter hunts along the road and just coming up a little bit on this edge of the property line, but we didn't want to be intrusive to the rest of this and really turn it into high quality habitat in the long term, doing some open field development, which we can talk about that in a moment. And then similarly on this north edge, very limited use to come up this west side and really high risk hunt because of the entry points into this property. The majority of the time we're coming right up the middle and accessing, really from the inside out to hunt the perimeter of the property where the best quality deer patterns are going to be.
Right. And so given your access and given limitations of this property, tell me about the bedding, because, you've mentioned we're not necessarily trying to hold all the deer all the time on this particular piece. So what were we developing and how are we thinking about the bedding here, especially as it relates to that internal access?
Mm-hmm. So coming up the middle here, we're going to keep this pretty open. And it was a pretty open wooded area also. We would like to maybe have some barricading here along the roads that we're going to define this lower pattern for deer to move along. There was a nice flat in here of what I would call a bedding flat, and we're definitely going to develop this, and it has since been developed for bedding along this flat in here because it was a great place to house does and keep deer on the property. Similar over here, but really that was it. And we didn't want to bed deer in the core here where we're coming and going. We're trying to say, hey, we want the deer to be peppered along the perimeter and then come in again inside out to go hunt them. Also, let me talk a little bit about this open field development between hardwood plantings, conifer plantings, trying to develop what, this is kind of a little bit of a ridge here too. Develop more interconnected cover. So we get that right away within a couple seasons with the switchgrass you see everywhere. But then also over the long haul, developing this top ridge into more of a interconnected cover. We're going to get deer that move through this a lot more because when we showed up on the property, this whole upper top was a big wide open hayfield. Deer aren't crisscrossing this and aren't comfortable within it. They're going to want to stay really to the west or to the east. And that's okay. We're still going to hunt those opportunities, but I think having these points of cover within are really going to make deer go east-west a lot more throughout the property.
Yeah, I think this property really highlights the importance of having someone come out with a second set of eyes rather than relying on, the information that exists out there in the universe of just saying, hey, always have your access on the outside. Well, you're going to be banging your head against the wall if you try to do that here. So let's
missing opportunities. Missing opportunities as well, and I want to drive on that to say some of the best hunting is on the far east edge of this property. You have this huge amount of timber in here and amazing plantings to the north. The conifer plantings are probably in that 15 to 25 year range. They're getting good and thick. A lot of good quality hardwoods and brushy habitat to the south. Well, deer are going to travel along this route. And as we often find, this is the top of a drainage. Right here is an enormous pinch point, but it happens to be on our client's property. It's not on the neighbor's property. So the deer might be hanging out in here, but as they go north or south, they're creeping onto this property, even just for 200 yards. They're going to bump through this corridor and bump back off. And we got them pinched really well. We emphasize that there's an existing bedding area here that kind of helped with that pinch point. And we had a water hole mock scrape and a tree stand that we're just coming just into the edge of the cover and accessing from the west, as we showed here, coming up that main inner road.
Right. Let's talk about that just a little bit. So, oftentimes we can think about neighbors as the ones who are shooting our deer, or the neighbors that we are competing against. We're trying to keep the deer over on our side. This is a great example of using the neighbors to your advantage. Not only what their properties offer, but also what their activities, you know, benefit us, how they hunt their property, how they treat their property. How does that benefit us? So talk to me about
Yeah.
what's going on the neighboring property and how that actually fits into the design on this piece.
Yeah, so these adjacent properties, so to the east, their driveway and road into the property and buildings are down here. Any entry they make into the property is doing a deer drive into this one. Okay. Similarly to the north, we have this conifer row plantings here. Any movement they have down in here, it could flush deer south into this habitat. And I didn't talk about it before, but we're giving them food right along this edge too. So as far as having a through travel movement, okay, a deer can come for just 100 yards and be um, in this travel plot surrounded by switchgrass. It's a little bit lower. The ridge really follows this road. So this is just a maintenance road, this white line here, but we're giving that opportunity for the deer to just cut through there. And again, as we said it before, the neighbor's movement could chase or bump deer on. The natural tendency they're going to have to set foot and just hug this edge of timber all the way around as they move north-south, and plus the fact that we're introducing a food source that these properties don't have. So we're taking advantage of, okay, what is their limited resource? Okay, we just provided that, and now we're going to benefit in those deer coming onto the property early morning, late evening, and have those type of hunts.
Yeah. Let's dive in a little bit deeper then on that, kind of neighbor piece with the drain top there. What were you seeing when you were on site there, and how did that translate into the design? I know you mentioned there was already some strong bedding there, but how did you take that to the next level?
Yeah, great point. And what we have here, and it's a little bit hard to see, and I'll just maybe just poke a line in here to let people have an appreciation of it. Is there's a really tight drainage through here, and when I say drainage, that's the focal point of all of the flow that comes off the hills and develops this very steep, rugged terrain that deer do not easily cross. Well, where do they cross is where that flattens out toward the top of the hill. And what we will often find in hill country, we talk about it all the time, is that first movement at the top of that drainage is going to be a strong pattern for deer. This is a textbook example of that. And when we saw this, that trail was 2 feet wide, 8 inches deep, just worn down like a cattle path of deer movement through here. Every deer that's going from north to south or south to north, they aren't going through here. They're funneled up to the top. They're pinched through here. Again, that bedding area, that was just an existing thing, but we would do similar cuttings that might further define that. So to build this, we'll get into the land management piece, which we also do. We have a water hole, a mock scrape. That water hole we're going to put just on the outside of the corridor from where we're hunting, so we get that quartering away shot. Between the mock scrape and the water hole, there is I think our cameras would tell us 100%, but there is 90+% chance that deer is stopping in that spot. And generally in these situations, I'm only having one shooting lane. I might have a secondary opportunity each side, but for the most part, I'm looking to catch that deer at that mock scrape or at that water hole. We've done some cuttings. We might knock down a few trees to make sure that deer don't just wander from that trail, especially bucks. Bucks are going to be a little bit more wary of that pounded down trail. But if we haven't given them many options, plus pre-rut, especially in the rut, water holes are hot. They're going to want to get to that point. I've seen situations where does might be running through. The doe just tear through on that path, and dog's behind it. That buck's going to stop and take a quick drink before he keeps on going. He wants to hit that water. He needs water more than anything during the rut, and gets dry in a lot of areas of the country, especially we see this a lot. If you can keep water in those water holes, you're going to have a very successful rut hunt sitting in that location.
Right. And one thing that, maybe this is for a waterhole episode, but one thing I'm noticing there, you've got it on the downhill side. I'm guessing this is one of those holes that's going to keep itself full, which I think was an important point when we're talking about putting water holes in to some of our best locations like this one. We don't want to be in there once a week filling this water hole up. So we don't want it to be a 25-gallon plastic tank, and we don't want to be in there every week. We want it to feed and fill itself. So what are some of the things you're doing there?
Yeah, for water hole 101 is going to be making sure it's located in a spot that has good natural drainage. That might be just a little localized pothole that's going to drain some water to it, or it's actually in that drainage that I described earlier. So a lot of water might flow through there. You get a 1-inch rain and boom, it's full. We are absolutely going to have a minimum of a 100-gallon tank. Some applications now are doing 200 or 300-gallon tanks. So that they hold that water. We want a good deep water hole. A lot of these ones out there, they look great. That looks so natural. It's shallow. It kind of slopes down. It's got nice color, all these things, but they're shallow. You only get 8-10 inches of water in those things, and they dry up very quickly. Our totes are going to have 18 inches minimum depth, and a deer will climb right down in there to drink out that last 2 inches of water if that's all that's in there.
Right.
I mentioned it being on the opposite side of the corridor. I'll emphasize that again now. From where the tree stand is, the reason being is a deer's flying through that corridor. They turn into that water hole, giving you that quartering away shot. You might set a log or a rock or just something natural on the back side of that water hole such that they're never getting around the back side of it, such that they're facing you for that frontal shot that you don't want to take if you don't have to. I don't know. There's probably a few other things I glossed over there, but the mock scrape, I'll hit on that, is we want that mock scrape to be right on top of that trail such that they got to step around it. And, we got a 4x4, just a big, huge area, nice and flat. We don't want that ground to be sloped at all. We want to dig that out and make sure it's really flat at that location. And you teed it up too to talk about keeping that filled with water. When we construct these, we want to make sure it's really good and low. I mentioned that drainage, whether it's a pothole or more of a channelized flow. If that water hole isn't below that ground surface, it's not collecting water.
Right.
I say this often: you cannot put a water hole too low. You absolutely can put it too high, and I think that's something to be careful of.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. So let's look at the access then. That's probably the top challenge of this property. And you've got some creative stuff there with helping him get across this big open field and into these high quality hunting setups on that east side. What are you doing there to shield his access, but then also break up this piece? I mean, the screens that I see here are serving multiple purposes.
Yeah, well said, Josh. And a few things here. So we do want this to be kind of the business end, right? This is the hunter access. We don't want deer to necessarily even be through here. We want to give so many opportunities for deer to move east-west through the north end of the field here, and then east-west through the south end of the field, whereas the hunter goes through here. There's really nothing of interest. This large open area of switchgrass without any other open field development is really, you might see a deer skirt across it real quick, but they really don't have any interest in being there or certainly bedding there. You might see deer bed along the edge of switchgrass. They're not often bedding in large banks of switchgrass. This lighter green area could be annual screen. It could be a perennial screen. Switchgrass might be enough depending on the topography, or if you do a little bit of earthwork to make some berms, you certainly could get away with just switchgrass. But this could be annual plot screen. It could be a perennial screen like miscanthus grass. Sorry, I was at the tip of my tongue. I just couldn't say it. Or you could go to conifers. And while you want to be careful you don't create a bedding area with conifers, it certainly works great for a permanent screen to develop those conifers in certain areas of the country, right? Where you can have a successful planting that long-term is going to be your hunter access. That's what we have on our property. We're using Norway spruce, a little bit of white pine, and we're just a few years away from having that permanent, tall, evergreen screen that's going to help us be successful in our hunter access.
Love it. Love it. All right. So Sam, secondary to that east side there, I mean, obviously that's a no-brainer kind of a spot. What would you say is your other favorite spot on this piece that you just knew you had to take advantage of?
Well, we'll talk about the other end because we really haven't mentioned too much about this habitat down here, this lower drainage. Super brushy, thick. It's going to be a common bedding area for deer. Deer don't just bed up on the ridges like we show here, because it's thick and heavily timbered and brushy. This is a very, very quiet country road. There's a dozen cars a day that pass down there. It's all the people that live there. Anyway, we are going to have crossings that occur, and this, because we have a similar brushy situation here, we wanted to invite this. And also because, and you'll see this red area we identified here with this driveway and residence and all that, kind of as a human area on the neighbor's property. There's going to be a natural tendency to stay away from that. And between a skinny little plot here, there was some neat little topography features. I liked the stand that we can jump in right off the side of the road, right at the property edge. There's human activity here already, such that, a deer are going to move to and from the adjacent property. Maybe they're going to work across the road. They're going to hit this little travel kill plot here, and they're going to work their way up to the bigger fields at night, or, off to the larger ag fields. And, opportunities like that are really great. They can walk out the driveway, walk down the road, and be in their stand within 5 minutes, and really have a quick, easy evening hunt from their house there.
Love it. Love it. Well, Sam, we'll wrap this episode up the same way we did the previous one. What are some of the top mistakes that you see when you walk onto a hill country property that guys have been hunting for years? What are some of the top mistakes that you see being made, and how are you addressing some of this?
Mm-hmm. I think it's really important in these type of parcels to recognize the different aspects of the season, whether it's early season, pre-rut, rut, late rut, are getting into our gun seasons, late season. And I could add some more details in there. I didn't hit on all of them, but there are different stand setups for those different hunts. And also, I think it's common, very common in hill country, where guys wear out their best stands. And we need to work with them to say, this stand, you aren't going there until the end of October. Don't even think about going there. There's no reason to go there.
Right.
And don't wear out those spots and be very intrusive in your hunt, especially when you're working with smaller acreage like this. If we have a 500 acre farm and the guy wants a dozen hunting locations, and we're going to make it, those the best we can, he can take more risks. He can blow out deer. It's less of a deal, right? He might only go to that stand once that season. But in these situations, a guy might look at it and say, a dozen tree stands on 40 acres. What's going on here? Well, that one stand you might only use 1 week of the season, and you're going to go there one time. And I think that understanding what these are for is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of the guidance that we provide. When we're doing a consultation, when we hand somebody a plan, we're not just saying, hey, here's where to put your stands. We're also giving them the hunting strategy piece of, here's why you need to stay out of this spot in particular during the early season. And here's why the pre-rut is the time, or the rut is the time, or hey, once gun season rolls around, we're going to avoid this area. We're going to let our deer filter in. That's another relevant conversation coming up here in November, with gun season right around the corner for much of the country. Well, Sam, any last thoughts on this piece or hill country that we need to leave the listeners with?
We didn't spend a lot of time talking about topography. I think it's just good to mention that if you have a hill country, or whatever the term might be in your region of the country, if you have a parcel that has a lot of topography, there are specific ways that deer utilize that topography, and taking advantage of that, understanding it, identifying it, taking advantage of it, and all those different topography features is something that goes into our planning, something we consider, and it's a really important facet within hill country. Didn't even say the word wind, I think, the entire episode here. Understanding, how wind changes in hill country, and some of the resources we bring to a consult with that, I think, is another important factor. You can't just take this one, copy paste it to another parcel. It's going to it's going to vary depending on your setup and orientation with those hills.
Yep, absolutely. Wind and thermals, whole episode in itself, and how it applies to hill country, and how we're helping landowners deal with some of the challenges that may come along with that. So, folks, if you want to learn more, head over to our website, whitetailpartners.com. You can also find us on YouTube. Hopefully, you're watching this episode on YouTube as opposed to just trying to listen to it, because if you just try to listen, you may struggle just a little bit. Probably should have put that at the beginning of the episode. Go watch this on YouTube instead of listening to this one. But Sam, thanks for joining me today. I appreciate it, folks. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next week.